Dr. Lane will be giving us a lecture entitled Newman, Anglo-Catholicism, and the Anglican Patrimony. Please welcome to the podium Dr. Christopher Lane.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elena, for that very kind introduction, as well as for all the effort you put in to organize these lectures, alongside especially of Dr. Bracy Bursnack. And thanks also to Dr. O'Donnell for his support of these initiatives in support or in celebration of Newman's canonization. And thanks also to our previous lecturers this week, and to all of you who have come to hear the final word on Newman. One more bit of thanks to Mr. Glenn McLeod, who works in our development office and who's actually well-versed in much of what I'll be discussing today. So I've actually learned a great deal from conversations with him about some of these matters. So I'd like to begin my talk on a personal note. On the 3rd of May, in the year of our Lord, 1981, I was baptized as an Anglican at Trinity Episcopal Church in Fishkill, New York. Now, Trinity is a lovely colonial-era building, originally built in the 1760s after a 1755 missionary visit to Dutchess County from the Reverend Samuel Seabury, rector of St. George's in Hempstead, Long Island, who later became the first bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States. Now, more or less shut down during the American Revolution because of the loyalist tendencies of many Anglicans, including the rector of Trinity at the time, the church was briefly used as a meeting place for the New York State Constitutional Convention in 1776, and it served as a hospital for the Continental Army for several years. And Trinity was the place where I first received Christian formation. I learned Bible stories and did crafts in Sunday school, and later participated in the church's youth group. My first lesson in Trinitarian theology was the church's single stained glass window featuring a clear medieval Latin diagram some of you have seen called the Shield of the Trinity. I served at the altar as an acolyte, and I heard the learned, engaging sermons of the rector, Father James Heron, who knew all his parishioners personally. Accompanied by our excellent organist, who also happened to be my piano teacher, I joined in the singing of the Sanctus, often to the music of Franz Schubert's Deutsche Messe. And before communion each week, in response to the prayer, "Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us," I responded, "Therefore let us keep the feast," out of my copy of the Book of Common Prayer. I knelt at the communion rail to receive what Father Heron taught me was the really present body and blood of Christ. After the service, my brother and I would get our donuts and cider at the coffee hour. Then we might run around the parish hall or poke around for treasures if there happened to be a rummage sale going on at the time. We might occasionally bob for apples at a Halloween party at the parish or eat pancake suppers on Fat Tuesday. And yet, moved by a variety of providences I need not discuss now, as teenagers, my brother and I, he first and then I myself the following year, left Trinity and entered into full communion with the Roman Catholic Church through a local parish of the Archdiocese of New York. And I could never express enough gratitude for the grace that came to me in the experience of coming home to Catholicism in that vibrant parish. And I did not experience any longing for Trinity or any real experience of loss. But that said, I want to note some differences in my experience of church life from what I knew as an Anglican. I traded a small face-to-face community with weekly post-service fellowship for a mega parish with thousands of families. I traded a simple yet noble rectangular colonial building for 1980s vintage church architecture, including pews arranged in a semicircle. I traded a communion rail for a standing communion line. I traded the 1982 hymnal, the organ, the choir, and the occasional string quartet for the gather hymnal and the predominance of guitar masses. Now, these changes were all in non-essential matters about which I am grateful not to have really cared at the time, or not significantly. I noticed these differences, and I dare say I actually embraced them as part of the deal. I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wasn't looking behind. They didn't make me reconsider for an instant, but it's worth mentioning them as illustrations of some of the questions that will come up in what I'm discussing today. So my chief goals in this talk are to introduce the concept of the Anglican Patrimony, to discuss its relationship to Newman and his contemporaries, to trace a bit about the rise and character of what can broadly be called Anglo-Catholicism, and to discuss the place of the Anglican Patrimony within the Catholic Church today, especially in the three ordinariates established in the past decade for former Anglicans. So first, let's consider this term Anglican Patrimony in the context of the establishment of the ordinariates. On November 4th, 2009, so we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, Pope Benedict XVI issued the document Anglicanorum Cetibus, which began with the following words, quote, "In recent times, the Holy Spirit has moved groups of Anglicans to petition repeatedly and insistently to be received into full communion individually as well as corporately into the Catholic Church." The document went on to detail the Holy See's response to these petitions, which would be the establishment of, quote, "personal ordinariates for those Anglican faithful who desire to enter into the full communion of the Catholic Church in a corporate manner." The term ordinariate refers to a structure within the Church that functions very much like a diocese. To call it personal is to emphasize that belonging to the ordinariate is proper to certain persons, rather than the normal default, which is that your geographical location alone determines which diocese you belong to, and therefore who your ordinary is. An ordinary typically refers to one's bishop. The Ordinariate Model would be somewhat analogous, although imperfectly, to the Eastern Catholic churches. And ordinariates would, as Pope Benedict proclaimed, quote, "maintain the liturgical, spiritual, and pastoral traditions of the Anglican communion within the Catholic Church as a precious gift nourishing the faith of the members of the ordinariate and as a treasure to be shared." And the term Anglican Patrimony is elsewhere used in the document basically as a shorthand for those liturgical, spiritual, and pastoral traditions, this so-called precious gift, both for nourishing faith within the ordinariates and this, quote, treasure to be shared with Catholics and others beyond the ordinariates. Now, in the decades since Benedict issued the document, 3 ordinariates have been established, one for England and Wales, one for Australia that also serves communities in Asia, and one for North America, of which I happen to be a member. Now we can go back in history and explore 2 threads of inquiry which can help us understand why this came about and why Pope Benedict saw the Anglican Patrimony as something to be treasured and shared. One thread to follow consists of efforts to bring the Anglican churches into greater conformity with Catholicism and thus to shed elements of continental Protestantism. So that's one thread. And another thread is to follow efforts to bring about a reunion of Anglican churches with Rome. So before we get to the 19th century, where a lot of the action is, you need to consider some background. In the early 1560s, Pope Pius IV sent conciliatory messages to Queen Elizabeth I in hopes of healing the schism of the English Church. Now, this is a schism which had only just been renewed shortly after the death in 1558 of Elizabeth's half-sister Mary. In addition to an invitation to send representatives to the Council of Trent, the evidence suggests that Elizabeth was also extended the possibility of retaining certain post-Reformation customs of the English Church, such as the English liturgy, according to the Book of Common Prayer, perhaps also married priests and the like, on the condition that England would once again accept papal primacy. Now, Elizabeth was not interested, as you may well know, and she continued to call herself a Catholic monarch, stating that the Pope was merely an Italian bishop. Now, divisions only became worse for Catholics as Elizabeth's reign went on. Nevertheless, Elizabeth's religious policies helped keep alive in her church many elements of liturgical ritual, for example, kneeling for communion, and even in her own chapel, candles on the altar, traditional doctrine, such as the role of bishops in church governance, and the like. And many more purely Protestant English churchmen would have wished to jettison these kind of elements. In the 17th century, a series of Anglican theologians and writers, especially those known as the Caroline Divines, made even stronger efforts to move the Church of England in a Catholic direction. They're called Caroline because most of them flourished during the reigns of Kings Charles I and Charles II. So the Latin form of Charles is Carolus. They did not reject the Reformation altogether, these Caroline Divines, but they valued things like the church fathers and the early councils and the medieval church. They promoted a stronger sacramental theology and a further restoration of liturgical rituals. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Lancelot Andrewes, one of the most prominent figures among these Caroline Divines, he served successively as Bishop of Chichester, Ely, and Winchester, and he died in 1626. He declared, quote, "The Eucharist ever was, and by us is, considered both as a sacrament and as a sacrifice." Similarly, Herbert Thorndike, lecturer and fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and later canon of Westminster Abbey, who died in 1672, agreed with this. He wrote, quote, "The sacrament of the Eucharist must needs be the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, because the body and blood of Christ are present in it as sacrificed." Among the writings of various Caroline Divines, you will find defenses of prayers for the dead, the necessity of having bishops consecrated in legitimate succession from the apostles. You'll find the sacrament of penance, the authority of sacred tradition, and the regenerative power of baptism in their theology. So broadly, we can lump together all these tradition-bound tendencies into the category of high church Anglicanism, as opposed to what is sometimes called low church Anglicanism. That low church tradition promotes the heritage of continental Protestantism, and the high church tradition has a Catholic leaning or looks towards the older pre-Reformation tradition in a greater degree. For complex reasons having much to do with the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and later the succession of King George I in 1714, high church and Catholic-leaning theology and practice actually waned in the Church of England during the 18th century. So the 17th century was a stronger time for it in many respects, although also a complicated story there. But in the 18th century, there was a bit of a downturn. At the risk of oversimplifying, the theology and practice of the established church were effectively more Protestant in the 18th century than they had been in the prior 2 centuries. But the high church tradition, especially as articulated by these 17th century Caroline Divines, would be instrumental in the next part of our story, what has been called the Catholic Revival within 19th century Anglicanism. And just to make clear the terminology before I move on, you'll notice that much of my use of the term Catholic is simply referring to Catholicizing tendencies within Anglicanism, rather than as an indicator of full communion with Rome having been achieved or even necessarily desired. So part of the 19th century story is that many Anglicans were themselves embracing the term Catholic and even repudiating the term Protestant, whether or not they were interested in papal primacy as an integral part of Catholicity. Indeed, in the early 19th century, we start to get significant use of the term Anglo-Catholic, which you'll hear me using. In later eras, this term Anglo-Catholic fairly stably denotes Anglicans not in full communion with Rome, but who emphasize Catholic theology and practice. Generally, self-identified Anglo-Catholics would claim that the Anglican churches were legitimate branches of the Catholic Church that did not need papal jurisdiction in order to be Catholic. This idea, incidentally, is called branch theory. I'll bring it up again a little bit later, but branch theory says, effectively, there's a Roman branch of the Catholic Church, an English branch of the Catholic Church, and then the Eastern Orthodox churches are another branch of the church. So returning to our narrative, let me remind you of the group of Anglican churchmen known as the Tractarians. These men, based generally at Oxford University, led an effort to promote the Catholic tradition within the Church of England, an effort that became known as the Oxford Movement. Those of you who were here on Monday heard much about them from Dr. Schwartz, and so I will go through this material relatively briefly. They were called Tractarians, and their set of positions called Tractarianism, because much of their advocacy came through a series of extended essays and other documents called the Tracts for the Times, published between 1833 and 1841. Among the chief Tractarians were John Keble, Edward Pusey, and St. John Henry Newman. A big part of the Tractarian project was arguing that making the Church of England more Catholic was in fact not an innovation, but a revival of the Church's proper character. And to justify these claims, the Tractarians looked for resources, especially in the early Church. This led them to begin publishing in 1838 annotated English translations of the Church Fathers in a series entitled A Library of Fathers of the Holy Catholic Church, anterior to the division of the East and the West. After several decades, the Library of the Fathers, as it's called for short, included about 50 volumes, and was sort of the impetus for other efforts to bring the Fathers into English translation. Another project, and I'll add, Keble, Pusey, and Newman were among the early editors of this project. Another project in which some of the Tractarians were involved, though more cautiously, was the republication of post-Reformation Catholic-leaning theology in a series begun in 1841 called the Library of Anglo-Catholic Theology. This series prominently featured many of the Caroline divines, including the figures Lancelot Andrewes and Herbert Thorndike I previously quoted to you on the Eucharistic sacrifice. Newman and Pusey, for instance, were a bit cautious about this project, and the reason was that many of the post-Reformation theologians that the series published were occasionally too Protestant for comfort. The Tractarians did value and use, nevertheless, what they saw as the best and most Catholic of this post-Reformation Anglican theology. Newman himself, for instance, published a translation of the private prayers and devotions written in Greek by Lancelot Andrewes. Again, briefly reiterating much of what Dr. Schwartz discussed on Monday, the Tracts for the Times and the men behind them were highly controversial within the Church of England, which again had been leaning significantly Protestant throughout the 18th century. The greatest of controversies came with the final tract, Tract 90, written by Newman himself and published in 1841. Tract 90 was an attempt to give a Catholic interpretation of the Church of England's official doctrinal statements, the 39 Articles. Now, this was no easy task, but as Newman recounts in his Apologia pro sua vita, he did this in good faith. Without rehearsing his arguments, I'll note just one of his concluding remarks. Quote, in giving the Articles a Catholic interpretation, we bring them into harmony with the Book of Common Prayers. And this brings up a factor I have not said that much about. The Church of England's liturgical texts were contained in the Book of Common Prayer, the final version to that point having come out in 1662 after the restoration of the monarchy. I'll say more about the prayer book in a little bit, but the prayer book arguably had been the most important locus for maintaining Catholic doctrine in the Church of England. And the concept behind this is simple. You may be familiar with the dictum, lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of praying is the law of believing. So the prayer book was a bit of an anchor that helped the established church maintain greater adherence to Catholic belief than was otherwise possible through all the controversies of prior centuries. But in the end, Tract 90's arguments were widely rejected by authorities in the Church of England and at Oxford University. This was the end of the Tracts and a major blow to the Tractarians. Newman responded by beginning to withdraw from the life of an Anglican cleric. As he wrote of it later in his Apologia, quote, when my principle was not granted, I did not draw back, but gave up. I would not hold office in a church which would not allow my sense of the Articles, the Catholic sense, the Catholic interpretation. To make a long story short for Newman, within a few years, he concluded that he must, in good conscience, enter full communion with Rome, and this he did in 1845. Many others associated with Tractarian thought and practice, including many clerics, also converted in the years after Tract 90. Examples include Frederick William Faber and Henry Edward Manning. But here we can transition, because the Anglo-Catholic story was far from over within the Church of England and within global Anglicanism, especially in the Anglican churches of the United States and Canada. And with this, we can see how the Catholic revival continued among those who did not convert. A major new turn in Anglo-Catholicism in the middle of the century was the rise of what was called ritualism, an effort to restore Catholic ritual to the celebration of Anglican liturgy. Controversies over ritualism rocked the Church of England basically for the entire second half of the 19th century. You can find tentative beginnings of attention to these issues during the period when the tracts were being published, but it wasn't a top Tractarian priority. Insofar as the Tractarians spoke about ritual reform, they mainly advocated simply that the Book of Common Prayer be followed in its fullness. And the context for this is that, again, during the 18th century, during that highly Protestant age, typical services in the Church of England were very low church in character, very much modeled on continental Reformed Protestantism. Churches had been stripped of crucifixes and high altars. The pulpit dominated and was central. There was no reservation of the host. Candles for purposes other than illumination were considered superstitious. Hymns would not be sung. The service included prayers and scripture readings, and ultimately centered on the hour-long sermon, preached not with an alb or stole, or surplice or chasuble, but in a black Geneva gown, more or less a form of an academic gown. Only 2 or 3 times a year in a typical parish would the Eucharist be offered. And so simply celebrating the full Eucharistic liturgy every Sunday would be a major step forward, and this is part of what some of the Tractarians are interested in. Following the rubrics in the prayer book, as they were written, would be another major step. There was a so-called ornaments rubric, which said that the service was to be done using the liturgical, quote, ornaments, as they were in use in the second year of the reign of King Edward VI, therefore 1548. So many used that rubric as a justification for the return of greater use of vestments, candles, and things like that. But from the 1540s onward, after the end of the tracts, the independent efforts of Catholic-leaning liturgical reformers began to coalesce into a coherent ritualist movement for the restoration of ceremony in the established church. Because as the ritualists knew, the law of praying is the law of believing. The Tractarians had already renewed among Anglicans a high theology of the Eucharist as sacrifice, an idea of the real objective presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And so the ritualists took another logical step from there, a step of celebrating the Eucharist with greater dignity and ceremony, often with a special eye to medieval liturgy and to contemporary Roman Catholic liturgy. The specific practices adopted early on included using the term the Mass for Eucharistic liturgies, facing eastward or ad orientem for Eucharistic liturgies, use of altar candles, use of vestments including chasuble, stole, alb, and maniple. The mixed chalice, not something we talk about every day, but following the traditional practice of mixing water with the wine to be consecrated for ritual purposes and symbolic purposes. Use of processional crosses and even crucifixes at times, use of incense in a thurible, which is actually distinct from just use of incense in a standing container, because if you have a thurible, you can incense things and people, which was definitely a no-no in the eyes of the tradition. Vested acolytes as well. So these are a few of the items you might see in a ritualist liturgy in the later 19th century. Over time, some introduced private auricular confession, statues, bishops' mitres, things like that. We get add to this major architectural reforms, the building of high altars on the eastern wall of churches, new churches being constructed in neo-Gothic style, pulpits shrunken and moved to the side, and the replacement of walled, enclosed pews with the more democratic setup of ordinary bench-style pews or even movable chairs. And I want to follow that thread of democratization, if I may use that word, for just a moment, as a part of this major sea change in church life. Because at first we might be inclined to think that ritualism would appeal primarily to highfalutin social elites who like their smells and bells. But in fact, ritualism made some of its biggest early inroads in poorer urban parishes, partly because ritualists often were kept out of appointments to more elite parishes, and partly because the ritualists saw ritual as a legitimate means of bringing the gospel to the poor. As the ritualist movement ramped up, opposition came from high authorities in the church and the state. Because the church in England was established by law, clergy who deviated from common liturgical norms could be punished with all the authority of the state. Clerics were often deprived of their positions, and in 1874, Parliament passed something called the Public Worship Regulation Act in order to oppose ritualism. A total of 17 clerics were prosecuted under this law between 1877 and 1887. The longest prison sentence served was a year and a half. So one cleric served a year and a half for bringing ritual into his parish and opposing his bishop in that matter. Other modes of opposition, especially riot and disruption of services, was happening even earlier than this. As early as the 1840s, you can find rioting. A very vibrant example comes from the 1850s in a parish in London, known as St. George's in the East, where the rector in 1842 had introduced candles, vestments, and the like. Now, his own parishioners didn't express any serious problems, as far as we know, with that for 17 years, but then in 1859, a campaign was initiated to end the rituals, and as a book by John Nash on the history of Anglo-Catholicism puts it, quote, "People turned their backs on the altar, drowned out the psalms, threw projectiles and firecrackers during sermons, turned dogs loose in the sanctuary, urinated in the pews, tore up and burned carpets, and smashed windows." Now, what did Newman think about all this? In some sense, after his conversion, he remained at some distance from the internal quarrels of the established church. But we get comments here and there that indicate a certain amount of skepticism about restoring ritual without a complete restoration of doctrine. And in particular, I think of Newman satirizing a certain kind of ritualist in his novel Loss and Gain, published in 1848. And in that novel, you have a character named Bateman, whom the narrator described as a bore, right? And there's actually a nice little passage about how you recognize a bore, and that it wouldn't be fair to the reader to show you all the things you have to do to recognize a bore, because you only realize that over time, and then you would be bored to death in the process. So he just says, basically, trust me, he's a bore. The first thing we hear Bateman say to the main character, Charles Reading, is, quote, "Are you disposed to look into the pretty chapel we are restoring on the common? It is quite a gem in the purest style of the 14th century, a real specimen of a Catholic chapel." Now, why would Newman critique and satirize this well-intentioned ritualist, bore as he may be? I think it's because of what we learn later when we hear Bateman asserting so strongly that the Church of England was already fully Catholic. Newman wasn't saying all ritualists were bores, to be sure, but he was stressing what he saw as inconsistencies in Bateman's adherence to Catholic doctrine, with such a strong emphasis on external expressions of Catholic doctrine, but while also expressing strong dislike of Rome and adherence to a church which has officially rejected Catholic interpretations of its own doctrinal statements. But within Anglicanism, it's fair to say that the ritualists ultimately won. Reforms introduced by the ritualists became mainstream for many members of the Church of England. One piece of evidence for this comes from a royal commission on ecclesiastical discipline that undertook investigation of questions of ritual. The commission concluded in 1906 that the extent to which liturgical regulations were being violated and excessive ritual introduced actually indicates that the regulations themselves were too restrictive. The Commission reported, for example, that vestments were worn for the Eucharist at over 1,500 parishes in England, and, quote, "Thousands of middle-aged persons now living have been accustomed to see those vestments worn as long as they can remember." So even though technically this had been in violation of traditional Anglican norms, as it were, the ritualists had enough perseverance in their parishes, despite opposition, that the opposition was aging out, right? And people had gotten used to it in a relatively short time of roughly a generation. As an addendum, I'll note that the ritualists faced some opposition in the Anglican churches of North America, but not nearly as much. This was in part because the churches in the US and in Canada had stronger foundations, even in their 18th century beliefs and practices, for the revival of greater Catholicity. And furthermore, especially in the US, of course, state power could not be wielded in the same way against ritualists. Moreover, both in the UK and elsewhere, ritualism transformed not only clergy and churches, which you could properly call Anglo-Catholic or High Church or any such label. The childhood parish of Trinity Episcopal Church that I mentioned, my childhood parish, is a great example of this. It's actually quite a typical Episcopalian church in the US. It was never anything you would identify as positively Anglo-Catholic. You would not see there the rosary or regular confession on any regular basis, or statues, or a monstrance. But you would see stoles and acolytes and candles and weekly Eucharist and reservation of sacramental elements and anointing of the sick with holy oils and bowing and kneeling for the Eucharistic prayer and a processional cross and golden chalices and the sign of the cross and many such ceremonial elements that had been so controversial in the 19th century. They're normal in the 20th century. And I would add that this ceremonial did facilitate a higher view of the Eucharist, even if such doctrinal questions were not discussed as often as you would hear in many Catholic churches. Over the course of the 20th century, ritualism resulted in more liturgical change, including prayer book revisions in some Anglican jurisdictions. Many Anglo-Catholics, especially in England, ultimately chose to take up variations on the Roman liturgy, often translated into the style of the Book of Common Prayer in that sacral language. These sorts of Anglo-Catholics saw the Roman liturgy as more in conformity with Catholic theology, the theology they embraced, as opposed to the prayer book tradition. Ultimately, if the law of praying is the law of believing, the successes of ritualism were successes in putting more of Catholic doctrine back in the center of Anglican life, despite the failure of Tract 90 so long before. Now, in order to get ourselves to the present, we need one more piece of 19th century Anglo-Catholic history, which is the rise of efforts toward corporate communion of churches. You'll recall my mention of branch theory, the idea that the Church of England was one branch of the Catholic Church, the Roman Church another, and the Eastern Orthodox churches another. As the Catholic revival in Anglicanism gained traction, the idea of restoring explicit formal communion also gained traction. Because if concord of doctrine was more or less reached, then corporate reunion might not be unthinkable. And so various Anglicans and Roman Catholics, including some of the converts influenced by Tractarianism, began to come together in conversation about the potential for such a corporate reunion. They formed organizations, they made various proposals. But of course, the potential for corporate reunion had some sticking points. One, of course, was papal primacy in the universal church. Now, some Anglo-Catholics were actually convinced of papal primacy, but were not convinced that individual conversion was appropriate. They rather wanted to await the fruition of efforts for corporate reunion. Other Anglo-Catholics holding in a more purist way to forms of the branch theory were like Bateman, believing that the internal government of the Church of England was not a matter for an Italian bishop, even should that bishop be the head of another branch of the Catholic Church. Now, another major sticking point was the status of Anglican holy orders, particularly the validity of Anglican bishops. Rome had traditionally rejected the validity of Anglican orders, and hence rejected the ability of Anglican clergy to validly confect the Eucharist. So all that Eucharistic theology is put into question if the sacrament is not being confected. The Holy See eventually reconsidered the question, but its conclusion, stated in the papal bull Apostolicae Curae in 1896, was that as a rule, Anglican bishops had not been validly consecrated, and the Church of England had thus lost apostolic succession. Incidentally, I'll note that some Anglican clerics themselves doubted the validity of their own orders even before this declaration. There was a small subset of Anglo-Catholic clergy beginning in the 1870s who sought episcopal consecration according to rites and by bishops who would be recognized as valid by Rome. So this might muddy the waters about sort of exceptions to the rule of the invalidity of Anglican orders. But prior to the definitive restatement by Pope Leo XIII that normal Anglican orders were invalid, the possibility of corporate reunion was more plausible. And Newman commented on one proposed path to this. In 1876, an anonymous Anglican priest, signing his document as Presbyter Anglicanus, published a pamphlet that was originally a letter to Henry Cardinal Manning, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, and this letter, Manning himself permitted to be published, and Manning was one of the early converts I mentioned earlier. The basic idea was, quote, the formation by the Holy See of a uniate Catholic Church. So that's a quote from the pamphlet that would involve conditional reordination of the clergy and acceptance of papal infallibility. And in this proposed uniate church, the English liturgical tradition would be maintained in its essence. A gentleman named Mr. Ambrose Phillips de Lisle, a layman who had converted to Roman Catholicism very early in the 1820s, well before the Oxford movement got off the ground, sent Newman a copy of this pamphlet. Newman's response in a letter of January 1876 to de Lisle at first was mildly skeptical. Newman was intrigued by the fact that Cardinal Manning seemed interested, but he said, quote, it seems to me a plausible scheme, but I am told few will feel inclined towards it of the ritualists. In other words, even the Anglo-Catholics inclined toward corporate reunion were not mostly inclined towards papal primacy or toward leaving a big part of the English church behind. Newman also, by this point quite familiar with the internal politics of Catholicism, noted that it would bring about new conflicts within the church universal. Quote, the Roman priests would be complaining that the rich, splendid Anglican church in their mission territory was drawing away at least the young generation and sucking from them their poor offertory money. And the Anglicans would be very jealous of the Jesuits, Redemptorists, or Passionists who gave missions in their parishes. Newman concluded in this first letter, quote, if the measure was sure to recover half England to the church, the Holy See might think of it, but not otherwise. But in a letter just 8 days later, Newman was a bit more optimistic. He said this, quote, in a letter also to de Lisle, quote, nothing will rejoice me more than to find that the Holy See considers it safe and promising to sanction some such plan as the pamphlet suggests. I give my best prayers, such as they are, that some means of drawing to us so many good people who are now shivering at our gates may be discovered. Right, so a more hopeful response just a little bit after the initial skepticism. Then in a letter of May that same year, Newman has another letter to de Lisle, apparently consoling de Lisle about the unlikelihood of the scheme moving forward. Newman writes, quote, I grieve indeed to hear what you tell me about church matters and for the severe pain it gives you. It seems to me there must be some divine purpose in it. It often has happened in sacred and in ecclesiastical history that a thing is in itself good, but the time has not come for it. And thus I reconcile myself to many, many things and put them into God's hands. I can quite believe that the conversion of Anglicans may be more thorough and more extended if it is delayed, and our Lord knows more than we do. Now, there's much more that could be added about the development of Anglo-Catholicism, including more on the effects of Catholic revival within mainstream Anglicanism, things about the restoration of Anglican monastic life, the growth of ecumenical dialogue during the 20th century among authorities in Rome, Canterbury, and the Eastern Orthodox patriarchates, as well as the rise of what is called continuing Anglicanism. But leaving those aside, I'd like now to bring us closer to the present and to our initial thoughts about the preservation and sharing of the Anglican patrimony within the Roman Catholic Church. The Oxford movement, as we have seen, and the subsequent Anglo-Catholics of the 19th century, in terms of doctrine, liturgy, and even to some extent ecclesiology, revived in the Anglican churches a patrimony that was indeed largely compatible with Catholicism, a patrimony that could, if you'll pardon the metaphor, sing Catholicism in an Anglican key. And as we know, Newman was a huge part of making that happen. So when leaders both among Anglicans and on the side of the Holy See were ready, much later in the 20th century, it began to be possible to preserve elements of that patrimony within full communion with Rome. The first major step came in 1980 with a twofold endeavor put forward by St. John Paul II, one called the Pastoral Provision and one called the Anglican Use. These are really two things that come in tandem. The Pastoral Provision was a case-by-case allowance for married Anglican clergy to remain married and be ordained as Catholic priests. The related initiative, the Anglican Use, was the adaptation of the Book of Common Prayer, in this case the U.S. Book of Common Prayer, with some revisions, as a form of Catholic liturgy for the Mass and for the divine office. These moves were the result of a long period of dialogue with Anglican clergy and faithful who desired full communion with Rome while retaining certain elements of their liturgical and spiritual traditions. And this effort in 1980 facilitated both individuals and a handful of whole parishes to enter into full communion with Rome while preserving the best of the Anglican patrimony. All of the Anglican Use parishes were in North America, and I believe all were in the United States. But as I discussed at the beginning of this lecture, in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI went further and established the Ordinariates. Because for many years, many more Anglican groups, some in communion with the main bodies of Anglicanism, and some having separated from the Anglican communion over issues such as the ordination of women, both types clamored for full communion with Rome. And they noted their complete acceptance of papal primacy and of the fullness of Catholic doctrine. The bishops of a group called the Traditional Anglican Communion, so separate from the main line of the Anglican Communion, for example, signaled their fidelity in the year 2007 by signing a copy. The entire body of their bishops signed a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church as an expression of, quote, the faith we aspire to teach and hold. This copy they presented to the Holy See's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith with their request for full corporate communion. So, with the establishment of the Ordinariates, what does the Anglican patrimony really consist in then? What are the treasures of Anglicanism that are indeed worth sharing, as Benedict said, with the universal church? And that's a question that's been under heavy scrutiny in the decade since Benedict's Anglicanorum Cetibus. I'm happy to explore this more in the Q&A, but now I'll propose just a small number of items that I think fit into this. First, liturgy in the tradition and the sacred vernacular language of the Book of Common Prayer in its various versions, I think is a key element. The Anglican Use was a first effort at that, and the Ordinariates now have a robust missal called the Divine Worship Missal, with roots both in the prayer books and in the Anglo-Catholic translations of the Roman liturgy. I'll add, just as a public service announcement, it has been now confirmed that we will have a liturgy according to the Divine Worship Missal here on campus for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is transferred to Monday, December 9th, for the 10 a.m. Mass. So a priest of the Ordinariate will be here so we can experience that together. Now, I'll note that Newman, after his conversion, himself showed occasional touches of sympathy for attachment to the prayer book and to its language. And in particular, back in his novel Loss and Gain that I mentioned, there's a character, Mrs. Bolton. Now, Mrs. Bolton appears reprimanding her two daughters, whose heads have been filled with new ideas during the Oxford movement by a couple of handsome Anglo-Catholic Oxford undergraduates. And Mrs. Bolton says, quote, "I value the prayer book as you cannot do, my love, for I have known what it is to one in deep affliction. May it be long, dearest girls, before you know it in a similar way. Because if affliction comes on you, depend on it, all these new fancies and fashions will vanish from you like the wind, and the good old prayer book alone will stand you in any stead." An even stronger affirmation of the value of the prayer book comes from a later Anglo-Catholic, whom some of you know, G.K. Chesterton. Before his adherence to Rome, he was an Anglo-Catholic, and later in his book, The Well in the Shadows from 1935, he said this: "I can speak, I think, for many other converts when I say that the only thing that can produce any sort of nostalgia or romantic regret, any shadow of homesickness in one who has in truth come home, is the rhythm of Cranmer's prose. The English litany, the music and the magic of the great 16th century style, that does call a man backwards like the Song of the Sirens, as Virgil and the poets might have called to a pagan who had entered the early church. But why has the old Protestant prayer book a power like that of great poetry upon the spirit and the heart? It might be put in a sentence. It has style, it has tradition, it has religion. It was written by apostate Catholics. It is strong, not insofar as it is the first Protestant book, but insofar as it was the last Catholic book." And with the prayer book comes not only the Eucharistic liturgy, but the divine office, which I have barely mentioned so far. And this is something that many have cherished in the Anglican world and that many in the ordinariates still cherish. Today, forms of the divine office based on the daily office in the Book of Common Prayer are now in use as the official prayer of the church, so official liturgical actions of prayer in use in the ordinariates. And the ordinariate forms of the office center around morning prayer and evening prayer, typically known in the Anglican tradition as matins and evensong. And in 1955, appreciation was shown for this tradition by a Catholic convert from Lutheranism. Some of you may know of Father Louis Bouillet, and he very eloquently commented on this. He said that the prayer book morning and evening offices made up, quote, "a divine office which is not a devotion of specialists, but a truly public office of the whole Christian people. The offices of morning prayer and evensong, as they are performed even today in St. Paul's, Westminster Abbey, York Minster, or Canterbury Cathedral, are not only one of the most impressive, but also one of the purest forms of Christian common prayer to be found anywhere in the world." One last example of Anglican patrimony I will give is a long tradition of spiritual and devotional writing that includes the best of what was produced even after Canterbury split from Rome. A testimony to this is the contents of a book called The Customary of Our Lady of Walsingham. This is the first divine office book approved by the Holy See for use in one of the ordinariates, in this case the one in England and Wales called the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. And an option in the divine office is an inclusion of a non-biblical reading for the particular liturgical day, generally taken from a source in this book from the English or Anglican tradition. And authors included in the Customary of Our Lady of Walsingham for these non-biblical readings include St. Bede the Venerable, St. Aelred of Rievaulx, sort of classic medieval English saints, as well as Richard Rolle, a medieval spiritual writer, St. John Fisher, St. John Henry Newman himself, quite extensively. But not only that, also the Customary of Our Lady of Walsingham includes Caroline divines like Lancelot Andrewes, and Tractarians like John Keble and Edward Pusey, Tractarians who never entered full communion with Rome. Insofar as what they were writing in a sermon or some other text was Catholic, such authors have been preserved by the Holy See, approved by the Holy See for use in Catholic liturgy. And this only makes sense according to Pope Benedict's mind, for he desired that the ordinariates would preserve not only Anglican liturgical traditions, but also Anglican, quote, spiritual and pastoral traditions. Perhaps Newman paved the way. Perhaps the widespread approval within the Roman Catholic Church of Newman's pre-conversion spiritual writings paved the way for the acceptance of other writings that were written by people who were not Anglican or not Catholic at the time. So especially I think of Newman's wonderful volumes, the Plain and Parochial Sermons. This showed that a Catholic-minded Anglican could produce something that could safely nourish Catholic faith. Moreover, without the Tractarians, including and maybe even especially St. John Henry Newman, the Anglican Patrimony may well have never recovered its latent Catholicism, internal to the Anglican Church. Petitions for full communion with Rome from groups of Catholic-minded Anglicans might never have happened. Indeed, such Catholic-minded Anglicans might not have existed in significant numbers but for the doctrinal reforms of the Tractarians, nor would they have existed without the liturgical reforms of the ritualists based in Catholic sacramental theology. Nor would they have existed maybe, or maybe they wouldn't have sought the same things without the unfulfilled dreams of corporate communion that arose among 19th-century Anglo-Catholics. And indeed, just maybe, there was the influence of St. John Henry Newman's, quote, best prayers, such as they are, that some means of drawing to us so many good people who are now shivering at our gates may be discovered. Thank you.